Welcome to The Explainer. So previously, we've explored explanations for why people commit crimes that were rooted entirely in the physical world. We looked at the classical theory, which framed crime as a simple, rational choice, and then the biological theory, which suggested criminality might just be written directly into a person's physical body. But today we're pivoting away from the physical world. We're going to look inward, directly into the unseen depths of the human mind.
We're making a pretty sharp contrast today. We're moving completely past the ideas of cold, calculated choices and inescapable biological destiny. Instead, we're asking a totally different set of questions. Like, what is actually happening inside a person's thinking? What's going on with their unique personality or their emotional development? You see, psychological theories focus entirely on how these internal, mental factors make crime more or less likely. We're basically trying to map out the unseen forces driving human behavior.
Okay, let's dive into this. We have a clear four-part agenda for today's explainer. 1. Freud and the unconscious. 2. Measuring criminal personality traits. 3. Cognitive theory and morality. And 4. Putting it all together. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, Freud and the unconscious, which is also known as the psychoanalytic tradition. Our first lens is the psychoanalytic tradition, and it's actually the earliest systematic psychological theory of crime. Founded by Sigmund Freud, this approach delves deep into early childhood experiences. Freud proposed that human personality is actually made up of 3 distinct interacting structures, and understanding how they clash is absolutely crucial to grasping this theory. The first structure is the id. Honestly, think of the id like a completely chaotic toddler. It is the most raw, demanding impulse within us. It's primitive, entirely unconscious, and it's there from the very second we're born. The id operates on exactly one rule, what Freud called the pleasure principle. It wants immediate satisfaction for basic biological drives, whether that's hunger, aggression, or sex. It has absolutely zero regard for consequences, social acceptability, or logic. It literally just wants what it wants right now. Developing a bit later in childhood, we get the exact opposite of the id, the superego. You can think of the superego as our strict, deeply ingrained internal moral compass. It's our internalized conscience. And where does it come from? Well, we absorb it largely from our parents and the broader society around us. The superego represents all the rules, the guilt, and the high ideals we're taught to live by. It is that little voice constantly telling us what's right and what's wrong.
And caught squarely in the middle of this intense, internal tug-of-war is the ego. The ego is the rational mediator. It's the pragmatic part of the mind that's stuck trying to negotiate between these two extreme forces. It desperately tries to find a way to satisfy those raw, demanding impulses of the id, but it has to do so in ways that the strict superego and the actual, physical, real world will tolerate. It is a constant, delicate balancing act.
So you're probably wondering, what happens when this internal balance completely fails? How does Freud's structural model actually diagnose and explain criminal behavior? According to this tradition, criminal behavior is essentially a total failure of that internal balance. And there are 3 primary ways this breakdown happens. First, a weak ego. If the ego just isn't strong enough, it can't manage the pressure from the id, and a person might act on raw, violent impulse without any restraint whatsoever. Second, an underdeveloped superego. This is often linked to absent, inconsistent, or even abusive early parenting, meaning the person simply lacks the internal guilt required to hold criminal impulses in check. And third, actually this is a really fascinating counterintuitive idea, an overly harsh superego. Some theorists argue that an incredibly punishing internal conscience creates this unbearable unconscious burden of guilt. In this scenario, a person actually commits crimes in order to get caught and punished, literally just to relieve that deep, pre-existing internal guilt. Crazy, right? Now we have to acknowledge the major academic critique of this framework. Psychoanalytic theory has been widely criticized by modern criminology because its concepts are notoriously difficult to test scientifically. I mean, you simply can't put the unconscious mind into a test tube or measure repressed drives with hard data. However, even with that critique, its core insight remains broadly accepted. The idea that early childhood experiences, especially parent-child relationships in those first few years of life, heavily and permanently impact adult behavior.
Moving right along to Section 2, Measuring Criminal Personality Traits.
So we're transitioning away from the hidden depths of the unconscious mind and looking for hard, measurable data. The central question trait theory asks is very direct. Are there specific, stable personality characteristics that we can actually quantify? Like, can we identify measurable traits within someone that predictably increase the likelihood they'll engage in criminal behavior?
And this brilliantly illustrates the work of British psychologist Hans Eysenck. He built assessment tools to map human personality along measurable dimensions. Eysenck found that people who score high on two specific things, impulsivity and a reduced sensitivity to conditioning, were statistically way more likely to commit crimes. Reduced sensitivity to conditioning basically just means these individuals do not learn readily from punishment or negative consequences the way most people do. This is a massive takeaway. It explains why standard prison sentences simply do not deter certain repeat offenders. Their brains just aren't wired to process the threat of punishment like yours or mine.
This research directly connects to the concept of the antisocial personality and its most extreme form, psychopathy. Psychopathy is defined by a very specific cluster of measurable traits: extreme manipulativeness, a marked lack of empathy or remorse, very shallow emotional responses, and a highly impulsive antisocial nature. And here's a wild statistic for you. While true psychopaths make up roughly 1% of the general population, they can make up to 25% of the prison population. That's huge. And this isn't just theory. Forensic psychologists actively use structured assessment tools today, most notably Robert Hare's Psychopathy Checklist Revised, to evaluate offenders. These measurable scores play a real, practical role when courts and parole boards are evaluating an offender's risk of reoffending.
All right, Section 3, Cognitive Theory and Morality.
This brings us to the third prong of our investigation. Here, we aren't looking at unconscious drives, and we aren't looking at static personality traits. We're looking at active, conscious thought processes. We want to understand how people process information, how they reason through moral situations, and ultimately, how they rationalize their actions. A foundational piece of cognitive theory and criminology comes from Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral development. Kohlberg basically proposed a ladder of moral reasoning. At the bottom stage, behavior is governed simply by a desire to avoid punishment. As people develop, they move up to seeking social approval. And eventually, some reach the top stage, acting on internalized ethical principles regardless of external rewards or threats. The key finding for criminology here is this: habitual offenders often suffer from arrested moral development. Research shows they frequently remain stuck at the lowest, most self-interested stages of this moral ladder compared to non-offenders of the exact same age. Now, what's really interesting here is how offenders actively justify their behavior in real time using what we call cognitive distortions. These are patterned thinking errors. Consider minimizing the harm they caused, externalizing blame by making it the victim's fault or society's fault, or feeling an overwhelming sense of entitlement to just take what they want regardless of the cost to others. These aren't just random excuses, They form a coherent, self-reinforcing worldview. Through these cognitive distortions, the offender actually feels righteous and completely justified in their own mind when committing a crime.
But because cognitive theory focuses on conscious thought patterns, it actually leaves us on a very hopeful, treatable note. Because we can identify these specific thinking errors, we can actively address them. This is exactly why cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, has become a real game changer. It's one of the most evidence-supported and effective treatment approaches in modern offender rehabilitation programs today. CBT is designed specifically to help offenders identify their cognitive distortions and actively correct them.
And that brings us to Section 4, Putting It All Together.
Let's zoom out and see how this all builds a complete picture. We've explored three very different psychological traditions today. Bringing it all together, you can really see how the entire psychological landscape connects. The psychoanalytic theory points us toward early childhood and the unconscious conflict between the id, ego, and superego. The personality trait theory shifts to stable, measurable characteristics like impulsivity and psychopathy. And then the cognitive theory focuses on conscious information processing, highlighting arrested moral development and those self-justifying cognitive distortions.
So the absolute crucial point here is this. What connects all three of these psychological theories? It's the fact that every single one of them still locates the root problem inside the individual's mind. Whether it's unconscious, a personality trait, or a thought process, the explanation is completely internal. And that acts as the perfect bridge to where we're heading next. In our next explainer, the explanation is going to shift outward. We'll be diving into sociological theory, moving out of the individual mind and into the massive impacts of family, community, and social structures.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a question to chew on. Which of today's three psychological theories do you personally find most convincing as an explanation for real criminal behavior? Are we driven by unconscious childhood conflicts, our hardwired personality traits, or our conscious moral reasoning? I'd love for you to drop down into the comments and share your thoughts. And hey, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming explainer breaking down the sociological side of crime. See you next time.